Marta Rubio Codina is this magical combination of economist and child development specialist. So she can sort of put the numbers behind the child development. She is a specialist at the Social Protection and Health Division at the Inter-American Development Bank, and she works at the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London. She does I've interviewed her a few times. She is literally always getting on a plane going somewhere to go see a program, to Colombia, to Peru, to India, all over the world, looking at different programs, but through the lens of economics, not through just the lens of child development outcomes, but also through the lens of what you're going to have to tell a finance minister at the end of the day to justify these programs. So I'm going to pass it to her, and then we'll open it to questions.
Well, thank you to the Dart Center for inviting me, and thank you all for being here and participating. I've learned a lot from I've learned especially from the questions. These are questions that, questions you raise are very different from the ones that we usually get to the audiences that we talk to, and it's been very interesting to see how you think about these issues and think of ways in which we can all help each other. So yes, all of my formal training is in economics, but I've had the privilege to be working on early childhood development topics for the past 8 to 9 years, hand in hand with Sally, whom you all know. So I've been learning as much as I could, and throughout that time, I've always tried to detach myself from the economists a little bit and pretend I was not one of them. But today, I actually would like to do something slightly different, which is put my economics hat on and try and present things the way they view them, hoping that this can help you in your interactions with them. So I might get a little in the technical details at points, but with that purpose. So I'd like to start by talking a little bit about why is it that economists are so interested in child development. And I could give you a very short answer, which is that they really like to get their hands on everything that they can. Another short answer would be because of the enormous influence that Professor James Heckman, Nobel Prize, has had. He was a very well-known economist before the Nobel Prize and before all of the work he's done in early childhood. He's done incredible work in econometrics that's been groundbreaking, so he had a lot of credibility in the field, and his research and work on early childhood development has actually attracted a lot of attention from other economists. But also, the longer answer is because economics has always been interested in poverty alleviation, and human capital accumulation is thought, and it is key for breaking intergenerational transmission. So that is the reason we're really after poverty alleviation. And the way we've approached this has been thinking through the life cycle. And because, so the life cycle, it's a circle, it's a wheel, and usually you would look at a circle going clockwise, but somehow, because economists were interested in how to improve economic growth and how to improve GDP, they started focusing on adult lives and programs for adults, thinking of ways in which they could increase income generation and improve labor market outcomes, for hoping that that would increase productivity and that would increase nation's growth. But then, so they started working on a lot of job training programs and job reinsertion programs, and those had impacts, but not, there was mixed evidence and not the impacts that we're expecting, so they went sort of down the life cycle ladder and started focusing on education, college education, vocational training, then secondary education, the youth, and young adults, and trying to reduce school dropout rates and improve programs that would improve school achievement and school attainment, and also reduce risky behaviors and youth engagement in risky behaviors. And then they kept on going down because they were still not getting at what they wanted. Some programs were effective, but some were not. And so they started focusing on primary school and issues of quality of primary school, and then down to preschool, and then really focusing on the very early years. And all of that's been because of the evidence that you've been hearing about throughout these couple of days on the wealth gap, so the difference in cognition and language development and also health that start very early in life. And you've seen a lot of these graphs throughout the past 2 days. This is yet more evidence. This is from a study we carried out in Bogota, and this is showing cognition at the top and language at the bottom. And the yellow lines, these are the cognitive or language scores for children. This is a sample of low and middle income families in Colombia. So the yellow lines are for the 25 children living in the 25% richest households in this sample, and the green line for children living in the 25% poorest households. And these are kids, this is from 6 months to 3.5 years. And you see how the differences widen and how they actually become significant at age 1. Sally yesterday was showing evidence from these differences in IQ being different at 7 months. In Bangladesh, Colombia, we've got the same. And then in many different countries, everywhere you look at, very young children before 12 years, they're markedly different in their cognitive levels. So that got the interest of economists. And these differences keep on increasing to the point that by the time they are 5, when they're about to start primary school, this is data from Ecuador, and these are the words that a child of a mother, so on average, children of mothers that have completed secondary education, these are the number of words out of language tests, these are the number of words that they understand. But if you look, same sample, if you look at the mothers of children of mothers who have not completed primary education, these are the number of words that they understand. And so they get to school with these deficiencies, so very likely they're not following what's happening in the school, and that combined with poor quality, with poor quality of schooling, then the combination is a disaster. We've also seen that there is role for intervention, which has also interested economists very much. You can actually do something to get children from the red line, which is a suboptimal developmental trajectory, to the green line, which would be the optimal developmental trajectory. And another element that's been very convincing is all of the evidence from very small but very good studies, very rigorous randomized controlled trials that have had long-term follow-ups. And the fact that they were randomized was very important because they help you establish causal effects. And causality in economics is very important. You want to prove what causes what by doing something, what happens, and separate that from anything else. So there's the Jamaica study. There was that we heard about yesterday. There's been nutritional supplements. There's been so the Guatemala study that provided nutritional supplementation, and then 2 programs that provided quality preschool here in the US, the Advocacy and the preschool programs. All of these have in common that they had really long-term follow-ups, and they could show that the initial impacts on child development were sustained over time and translated into higher IQ gains and higher school achievement and increased wages and reduced behavioral problems and a whole bunch of very important outcomes 20, 30, 40 years later. So that also, this evidence has been critical in having economists and also governments worry and care about these issues. And then there's the investment argument and how profitable it is to invest in the early years. This is data from the preschool program. And then below in blue, you have the costs and how much delivering this high quality preschool program costed. Back in the days, in the 70s, and above you've got the benefits. And so those benefits include not only the private benefit for the individual that actually that received the intervention and then did better on in life and achieved higher wages, but also the benefits for society in terms of having people that were more educated, that got access to better jobs so that they could pay more income in taxes, and then all of the savings, right, from welfare benefits, from savings from programs to support to reduce school dropout, and then you see it's massive how much the crime savings are contributing to this calculation. So in this case, this calculation actually gives you a rate of return of 13%. So for each dollar invested, you're getting $13 back. And these calculations, these numbers are very powerful, and they're very powerful when you go talk to finance ministers. This is what they really are interested in. But one needs to be careful with these numbers. They've got a number of caveats because they depend on how you're computing costs and how you're computing benefits, how far along in time you're incorporating your benefits, then how do you discount the future? So this is just to say that these are they're important numbers, but there's variation in them depending on how you compute them, and you inevitably have to make assumptions. And at one level, it's important that we are all aware of those assumptions and limitations. But the very good news is that regardless, in the few programs that we've got data and we've been able to make these computations, regardless of the assumptions and how conservative we try and be, the rate of return is always positive and significantly above 1. So you always get more than $1 back per dollar invested, and substantially more. So that's why the interest. So what are we doing? What's the agenda in economics for early childhood, and what can we contribute? Well, so this, and I'm not joking. We really, remember I told you that it's key to understand how human capital is accumulated to break the intergenerational transmission of poverty. And so this is it. This is a human capital accumulation production function. So the way we think of this is the way in which we think about a production function in a factory for any other output. You've got different inputs that you combine in a certain way and you get your output. And so what this means really, your output can be your cognitive levels today, cognitive skills today. It can be social-emotional skills. It can be health outcomes. It can be school achievement. It can be a whole number of things. This is a dynamic model in the sense that you can have multiple periods of time. And so those skills are a function of your cognitive skills yesterday and your social-emotional skills yesterday and the endowment, the environment in your home and the education level of your parents, and how much investment there is in you, how much access to materials you have, books, toys, how much time, how much quantity of time, but how much quality of time are your parents or your caregivers, whoever they are, investing in you. Actually, what you put in this. So what's neat about this is that it's a framework, right? You assume a certain technology that has a certain productivity, and you can put in this technology as many elements as you want, whichever ones make sense. And what we're trying to do is have access to, get a lot of data to actually estimate this and have parameters and understand how much each one of these inputs, say time, contributes to cognition. And how much past cognition is contributing to cognition today. And do we need a minimum level of social-emotional skills for cognition to be able to translate into more cognition later? And put all of this in a framework so that once we have our perfect model, which is going to be possibly never, but once you have, you actually, this gives you a tool that then you can use to do simulations. Right? And so you don't actually need to run another intervention to know what is going to happen when you're trying to decide where to invest. And if you are constrained, you don't have enough resources to do everything you wanted to do, and you want to make decisions on whether I'm investing in this type of program or this type of program to promote cognition or language, and at which ages you could go to your model and try to see what the model will predict. In the same way that you do tax simulations, for instance. And you know who's going to win and lose from a tax reform just by that consists in increasing, labor income tax by using a tax simulation model. So this is what I think is the contribution. And so. And this also helps you understand not only what the impact of a certain intervention is on the outcome that you want to modify, but also understanding the mechanisms, what is happening, which are the channels of change. And that's powerful because it helps you then think about optimal policy, understand the constraints also, because we know, the rates of returns are so high. We know that there's these huge disparities and how they contribute to increase inequality. But then why is it that families are not families or governments or, in school projects, why is it that there's not sufficient investment in early childhood? Is it because, and this relates to the constraints that Asians, economic agents we talk about, are facing? Do we not? Is it because they don't know this production function? They just don't know that this little bit of input is going to result into that little bit of output. So because we've got other constraints like money and time and lack of access to learning opportunities, then we're not investing. Is it because we don't know, or is it because we do know, but we don't know what can we do about it, or we don't have the ability to do anything about it because we've got other more important worries? Or because we have poor health and cannot really focus on these. And this is physical health, but also mental health. And understanding these constraints, again, it's important because it helps you then decide what the optimal intervention in that context is, depending on where the constraints and limitations are. The other thing that we spend a lot of time talking about is understanding heterogeneity effects. And that means no other than who is benefiting the most and how are impacts of interventions varying by different characteristics of the population. So by age of the child, or by the initial ability, or by their nutritional status, whether they're stunted or not, or whether they're anemic or not, or gender, the poverty levels, the educations of their parents. And this is useful because then this helps you identify who is in most need and optimize your targeting. Again, in a context where you have limited resources and cannot do all you would like to do. And then also in thinking about this, and because we're thinking about efficiency, that's a critical word in economics, and how to deliver all of these interventions in the most cost-efficient way possible. Then again, thinking of when can you make the most when can you get the most of the investment that you make, then and this framework, it's important to understand when it is best to intervene and how long to intervene for. And the critical inputs to address. We've talked about this. And also understand whether there's any spillover effects amongst the household and within the community. And what can you do to optimize those, right? If there's positive interactions within the community or within the household, then that's very important to know, because the size of the benefits actually are larger. And so how can you intentionally trigger the right mechanisms to get to that output, to that effect? And all of this with the intention to inform policy and help governments develop the best possible policies. And so then you get into questions, and these are a lot of implementation questions on what's the best delivery mode. Do you have to run parenting programs through home visits or group visits, or do you want to consider daycare interventions and then preschool? What's the role for the media? What's the role for integration with other services and other type of interventions? And as I said, the ultimate goal really is to translate interventions into policy, and particularly for when you work for an institution like the Inter-American Development Bank and other multilaterals. Our job is to loan, so the institution loans money to governments to invest on certain policies, and those loans often go with technical advice. So my job is really to help governments design the best intervention possible and evaluate them so that they can be accountable to their citizens, but also and then spread the word, right? And this is where we need to publish our research, but we also need to, in different outlets, and this is where you can all play a very important role in sort of transferring the science into better policy. And so to do this, when you want to go from intervention to policy, it's very important to think about the implementation strategy. And there's been a bit of discussion of that over the past 2 days. But one very important element is, well, you need to really reduce costs. You need to make the intervention sufficiently cost effective. Otherwise, there's no way in which you're going to convince your finance minister, or any minister for that matter. But then the real challenge is how to do that while still sustaining quality and ensure that all of the effects that we've seen from the randomized control trials then are still there, and we don't miss out on results. Understanding that there'll be some compromise that will have to be made, obviously, because of the when you're talking about policy and national policy, then you're talking about a very large scale. So one of the challenges that we face in institutions like the IDV or all of the increasing number of researchers that are trying to translate research into policy. Well, number one is money. We heard that there's little spending in child development. Joanne was making the case this morning, there's not enough money spent on child development, but then actually the little money that is spent on children is not targeting to the earlier years, and we saw that that's what gives you the highest return, so there's an inefficiency here. So, sorry, I went too fast. The blue bars, that's how much money is spent. This is a sample of countries in the Latin America region on children 0 to 5. And these yellow bars is how much is spent on children in primary school. So the difference is substantial, very large, particularly in those countries to the right where there's more investment overall. So that's disparity, that's something that we need to keep advocating to reverse, understanding that the total levels of money spent on children are not sufficient to start with. Another big challenge, and there's been a bit of discussion of this, is, well, the fact that the institutional architecture is very precarious in the government. And what I mean by this is that there's a number of different no one really knows where early childhood or young children falls into. The nutrition interventions that belongs to the health ministries, and then education, preschool, that's clearly for education, but then daycare, so daycare for 0 to 3s, that's unclear. It's education, not clear. Is it social development ministry? It's the family. Some countries have family agencies, family welfare agencies. They have been traditionally the ones providing services for families and children, but then and how these institutions, these government agencies usually don't talk to each other. They have the sectorialized problem, and so they're actually looking at the child in different bits and pieces, and not putting the entire piece together. And this is a problem. There's a problem for when you're advocating for early childhood, so you don't know who you need to go and talk to. And not only it is a problem at that level, but also on the ground, there's very little articulation within institutions on the ground. So often you see families that are visited by very different programs, and each one attending one different thing without no real articulation. And then you think, okay, well then let's integrate. But that's also very challenging, and that carries their own set of problems, because if you don't have real articulation within the sectors, then you may end up in situations that they have been discussed and they have been flagged as a note of concern on just adding everything onto the one program. And you do see these on the field. If there is one home visitor, if there's a program that sends a home visitor to the home to do something, that home visitor is going to be given the responsibility of addressing absolutely everything. From parenting, if that was her, or health, whatever was her mandate, to detect child abuse and domestic violence, and in more rural areas, understand productive mechanisms and farming. And usually, if you want to really intervene at scale, your best bet is to work with local paraprofessionals, because they are there and they know the communities. But you can't expect a paraprofessional to be a professional on a number of different issues. So integration is necessary at a level, but you have to be very careful the way you do it. And without the institutional support, without real articulation between sectors at the governmental level, at that higher level, and that translated into proper articulation, then it's going to be very difficult. And by proper articulation at the lower level, I'm talking about referral systems that work, for instance, where you can identify problems and then refer them to someone, and they're being somewhere. It's not enough to just say that you're going to refer, but then not have a system, a service that addresses that. Workforce, that's another very important challenge that we face, and again, it's been raised. And as I was saying, you have to rely on local community workers if you want to service to people in more rural and dispersed areas, and it's not feasible to think that you can send professionals all over the Andes in Peru, for instance, or or throughout Brazil. So you need to rely on local community workers, but then there's the issue of pay. You need to pay them. You cannot expect them to volunteer. And you need to train them, provide them enough training for them to do the job that you're assigning them to do. And then remember that if you want them to do multiple jobs, then you have to train them on multiple things, and that requires time, and there's only so much that one can absorb. And then throughout you need to continue to provide support, ongoing training. And this is something that we struggle with when we talk to governments, and part of it, sometimes they're understanding, the government is, they are empathic with the situation, but the issue of pay, for instance, may require, and giving them, not only paying them sufficiently, but also giving them a contract with benefits like anyone feels entitled to have. It's an issue that goes beyond the capabilities of that Ministry of Social Development, because it requires changes in the labor regulations, and those are national laws that are not going to be changed one day from the other. So we need to keep advocating, and I think this is an area where one needs to continue advocating at the very high level, and it'd be an interesting area that I'd like you to write about, because it's not only that, yes, they need to be paid, but understanding that for them to be paid, there's national level reforms in the labor systems that need to change. And so that needs to be, and that's going to need time, but it certainly needs to be heard of enough times. Then, well, also many programs are never evaluated, and that is a risk. There were discussions on ethics, and the way that economists think of justifying the ethical issues around randomized control trials is, well, if you cannot prove that something works, then how do you justify all of the taxpayer money that is going on that one intervention if we don't know if it's going to have an impact? Is that ethical? And so that's why evaluation is very, very, very important, and related the issue of measurement for evaluation, but also for accountability. And also, as Joan was saying now, thinking of ways in which measurement can help support the development of programs. So how much do I?
10 more minutes?
Okay. So economists have been shifting to the new vision that Joan was talking about in the morning, which is good news. And this is a story of relatively successful in the sense that this is a story that shows how from evidence-based research we went to large scale. And so you heard the Jamaica intervention, what is now called RECHAP, and so the home visiting model with the provided stimulation for an hour in the home, and the incredible impacts that had on child development in the long term, but also how they were sustained and translated in wages, and you've heard this story and how powerful it was. So then a bunch of researchers at the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London were very interested in thinking of ways that we're working on conditional cash transfer programs in Colombia, and conditional cash transfer programs were thought in the mid to late 90s, the way to at that stage they were thought of the silver bullet to break the intergenerational transmission of poverty. So they realized they were doing the evaluation of the CCT in Colombia, and they realized of the important role that community leaders could have. And they combined and they thought, well, maybe one way to, if we wanted to scale the Jamaica model, then one way to do this would be by working with these local community leaders, these local women that are elected by community members to represent them in front of the conditional cash transfer program. And so that was the idea. And so that's how Sally and I started working together, and with our group in London, and we designed a trial that we implemented in Colombia, which was medium-sized in the sense that we had a sample of about 1,500 children, and it was designed as a research study, and our research question was to understand whether we could implement the Jamaica model at scale by relying on community ladies, whether we could train them and we could provide them with sufficient support to deliver the model at a larger scale. And also the other element of working with community women was to it was a way of reducing cost. And so that we found some impacts. We found some impacts on cognition and language after a year and a half, 18 months of intervention. And so then the Inter-American Development Bank became very interested. They had been actually following the experiences throughout. And so they decided to advocate for and use the findings from this research in Jamaica and in Colombia to advocate for a home visiting model in Peru in the previous administration under President Humala. And that was the CUNAMAS program that became a national strategy for early childhood development. And what CUNAMAS does, it services children under 3 in rural and urban areas. In urban areas is with daycares, but in rural areas, more dispersed and hardest to reach, it was through home visits. And those home visits, because of the research impacts from Jamaica and then from Colombia showing that it was actually feasible to implement this at scale, the program was heavily based on back at the time, the program was heavily based on the Jamaica curriculum and the delivery mode that we showed could work. And so this table, what I want to show here is what you may lose when you go to scale, and how it is very important to think about implementation strategies and continue fine-tuning the details and really working out the details so that you don't lose impacts. Because what we see is from a sample of, this is not the total sample, this is how many children were treated and actually received the intervention. Remember, Joan this morning said, asking children if they actually receive the program, or asking families. It's not only how many you want to reach, but also how many you're effectively reaching. So you had 100% compliance in Jamaica. That, as we increased scale in Colombia, that reduced to 81%. And in Peru, where the program is servicing 90,000 families, much reduced compliance, so lower uptake. But then see what's happening to the impacts. They're also reducing. This is no surprise, but we really need to continue to work in understanding the implementation and to avoid these impacts continuing to reduce, the size of the impacts that you're achieving to continue to reduce, because this is critical for sustainability. And that's how we started making the argument, right? That these impacts are, will stay. We know that in Jamaica they were sustained to 20 years. We now know that they were not sustained 2 years after in Colombia. And it can be related to the implementation. Maybe we set ourselves a challenge that was too high. We did reduce a lot the frequency of supervision, maybe by too much. Maybe it's an issue of measurement. Maybe these effects will reappear, as we've seen that they tended to shrink at ages 4 to 5, which is when these kids in Colombia were measured 2 years after, and they may reappear later. We don't know. We need to continue measure. But certainly, they're not there now, and so that raises a question of whether they'll be sustained in Peru and how much we need to continue to think about how to scale these things up. And very quickly, there's been little talk, a bit more this morning on preschool and daycare. So I just wanted to show some data on uptake of daycare. And when I say daycare, I mean services for children younger than 3. This is all data from 4 countries in the Latin America region. But the blue line are the access rates in 2000, and the orange line is in 2010. So access to daycare, and there's more and more children going to daycare. Now, the levels of quality are very, very low. This is a study in Brazil. On creche, on daycare centers. 50% of them are reported to have inadequate quality, and you can actually measure quality. There are tools And a lot of the most powerful tools of quality there's a few tools that measure the quality of the interactions between the child and the caregiver in the daycare center, which is the person that is going to spend all that time with them if the mom is at work. And those are those interactions, same as we've seen in the home visiting research. Those interactions is what actually translate into increased development. So 50% of the centers have inadequate quality, slightly below 40% have basic quality, adequate, not even, well, about 10%, and good quality, negligible proportion. And this is important because there's increasing research showing that poor quality daycare centers can actually be harmful for children. Children would be better off being at home, but in circumstances, children cannot be left at home. So it's important also for government. It has to be in the government agenda to invest in quality and not only expanding access. And with that, and a colorful picture from a home visit in Peru, I'd like to give you my contact details. And these are links of where you can find some of the publications and work that we are doing at the IDV. We've got a blog, Primeros Pasos, First Steps, and this is our best attempt to communicate to broader audiences, and just wanted you to have access to the resources. Thank you.
We're going to open it up for questions. I'm just going to ask one, and I guess that's a lot of data, a lot of studies, but putting on your best skeptic's hat, how are we as journalists meant to interpret that data as, I feel like there's a sort of an assumption, it feels in places like this, it's a foregone conclusion that investing in ECD is good. We have a narrative, we have Jamaica, which was super small and has long-term effects. We have Abecedarian and Perry, which were super expensive. And we have Punamas, which has gone to scale with a 0.1 effect size. Have we actually made the economic case for investing in ECD at scale? Like, is the evidence there?
I think we've made the economic case to invest in ECD. I think we do not know yet how to implement this program at scale, and that's a relatively new agenda. It's ongoing. It's been ongoing for a few years, but we don't know enough, and I think that's where we need to continue working. And so in terms of what the advocacy that needs to be done is, well, we need to start paying attention to all of these implementation issues, and we need to stop assuming that just by putting the money on early childhood development programs, I keep on trying to say young children now since John's comment this morning, but just by putting the money there, we're going to have things resolved. It's not about, in terms of talking to governments, it's not, okay, have that program and then you're off, you're done and set. And no, you really need to think very carefully how you're going to do these things. And then every context is different and has its own set of challenges. And you'll have to think through those. And that means you'll have to identify what the optimal intervention is in that context and how you actually want to go on about implementing it. But no, I think you've got the arguments to make the case, but we don't know how to execute the case. And that's what we need to continue building evidence on, and we need to, I think we have our own suspicions on what are the areas that one needs to address and where we need to generate the evidence and advocate for. But clearly we need to produce more of that. Yeah.
Just following on that, I hadn't seen a slide like that before that went from Jamaica, Colombia to Peru. I'm wondering if you've seen it for any other programs. I know that Reach Up is a pioneer. So just for everybody, including me, putting it in context, basically were you guys diving into the deep end? And so this is the report from the front of the very first longitudinal scaling up.
Yeah. Yes, and thank you. I guess we could do that with, I'm sure we could do that with other projects. When I say Jamaica here, that's rich up, and this has been our agenda of work for some time. But I mean, daycares, all of the evidence from high quality daycare and preschool has been influential also in a lot of policy around improving daycares and then expanding preschool. So,
what programs are you talking about? Would you want to see?
Yeah.
We make that list longer.
Yeah, I'm sure we.
Yeah, I think there are other studies that have reached not a national program, but larger numbers of children, like 750. There's one, I can't remember the exact number, in Pakistan there's one, that I know it wasn't randomized, but it was still a reasonably good study, and they had a reasonable impact. And Hamadani has just finished one in Bangladesh, again a modified version of Reach Up. And you see, we're all learning from each other, and they've had a big impact with about, I think, 750 kids. So it's not all, we're learning as we go along. And I think the big lesson from Colombia was we can't cut back on supervision.
I'm just going to ask a quick question. Can you maybe contextualize those numbers for all of us? So we know 0.8 is great, but what does 0.8 mean? What does that translate to? And is 0.1 enough to justify getting rid of a program? I mean, put that in context for us.
Okay, that's a hard one.
Sorry.
But it's a relatively easy one, except that it's hard to explain. So 0.8, I'll do my best. 0.8 means, so you've got a distribution. So I don't know. So let's look at the distribution of height for age, for instance. When we say that a child is stunted, you've got your normal curve, and when you say that a child is stunted, you and so you've got your curve here, and you've got your 0. That's the peak of the curve. And then you open 1 standard deviation and 2 standard deviations. When you say that a child is stunted, you're actually saying that that child has height for age below 2 standard deviations to the left of the curve, right? So minus 2 standard deviations in height for age in growth actually means that this child is at risk of delay, of growth delay. It's actually delayed. Yes, minus 3 would be extreme. So in fact, the way that when we talk about IQ scores, if you are 1 standard deviation below the mean for the population, between minus 1 and minus 2, that would be that you are at risk of developmental delay. Is that right? Minus 2 is you are developmental. Yeah, but 15 IQ points don't mean.
So 1 standard deviation in development is 15 IQ points if you're talking about cognition, right? To give you a rough idea. It may not be an IQ test, so 0.2 of a standard deviation is 0.2 of 15. So that's about 3 points? Yes. I'm not very good.
Right,
So
but what
it's
do
about
3
3
IQ points mean?
What's an
you
IQ
don't need to do
point?
that. I think I actually meant it, and I didn't ask the question very well, so I apologize. I think I mean, if 0.8 is a slam dunk for a finance manager to say, I'm going to invest in that because that is a large effect size. Where is the effect size that they're going to just say there's no chance? Like, I assume if they look at 0.1, they're going to say, I don't think that's too interesting, right?
It depends. You usually put that in the context of the impacts of other interventions and what are the effect sizes that they achieve. And the other way of looking at it is we talk about gaps and the deficits and these gaps in development, and those are also in terms of standard deviations. So then you could actually see how much of the gap is being closed by the intervention. Right, so you've got that difference, and suppose that you want to close that difference, and that's one standard deviation. If you got an impact of 0.1, then you're closing 10% of that difference. If you got a difference of 0.8, then you're closing 80% of that difference. So that helps understand. I think that maybe and is your way.
Yeah, so I was, Marta, I would like to ask you for advice for us journalists in terms of how to kind of look at government budget and get a sense of whether there is real money invested in ECD, even though it may not be a specific program, but like what else to look at. And if there are specific programs aimed at ECD, like, you know, in Brazil, like how do we kind of compare and contrast that with the overall budget? Like how do we trust that that money is really being spent?
Yeah. So this is where you'll have to go because of these lack of articulation. You have to go to various different ministries to see what's in their numbers. All of that, of course, is the ministers of finance have a specific budgets. There are people working on how to compute how much is actually being spent on child development. It's not an easy calculation because there are many different programs that are addressing different aspects, and you would have to, if you wanted to do a very comprehensive exercise, you would have to bring all of those pieces of information together. But you'll have to look for things, yes, parenting programs and daycare and preschool. You'll have to define your age range also, family support programs. And then how to know whether the money is actually being spent, that's a much harder question to ask. But it'd be helpful, I think, to go to talk to people in government agencies, and not only at the high level in capital cities, but also in regional offices where who are the ones that are sent the budget and actually disbursing and executing them, and talk to them about how much do they receive and what challenges do they face using that money, and what else do they need? What would they need money for instead? What happens many times in big programs is that budgets are allocated centrally, but that may not reflect the needs of the local teams running the program. So that might be another area that you could report on and could help. Yeah.
Can I just add one thing? The OECD has a ton of data. This is going to get, I think, the on the ground is great. And I do think I did this in Brazil with the Criança Feliz. When you ask people locally whether they're getting money, they'll be honest with you. When you ask the government, they won't be. So, but the OECD actually just did a massive report on ECD. They broke it down by country. There's country experts, and they actually have 6 classifications for daycare, childcare, pre-primary, pre-secondary. I mean, they have a kind of mind-boggling, not super clear, but it's a good starting point for data, and it's one massive report on ECD. So that might help.
Thank you.
There's this study that World Bank did in Nigeria in 2014. It's about combating malnutrition. It showed that Nigeria requires an annual investment of about $800 million to combat malnutrition. But government is investing less than 5 million annually. So I'm just, investment in ECD is seen as a social investment. So I'm just wondering if there is a kind of private sector initiative, if ECD can be seen as a way that, private sector's players can come in and invest and make profit from it. So have there been studies in?
Yes, that's a good point. And thanks. And there are private investors and a lot of foundations, foundations from private companies that are investing a lot of money and helping advocate and effectively investing in early childhood development. For instance, in Colombia, there is Fundación Éxito that is putting a lot of resources into generating evidence and advocating for evidence. Then there is this Fundación Carulla. These are supermarket chains that have their foundations doing philanthropic work. Carulla and Fundación Éxito. And so Carulla has has actually developed and put in place in various cities in the country a network of childcare centers, daycares, very high quality, that receive both children that receive both in one same center, children from high-income families and low-income families, and the high-income families are subsidizing the very high-quality childcare for the young-income families. For the low-income families, sorry, and that model is working quite well. It's been evaluated, and so that's an opportunity to. It's an expensive model, but again, what contributes to reducing costs is that it's partly subsidized by the high-income families, and this is all coming from private initiatives, from foundations that are doing philanthropy work, but they get resources from their private revenues. So there's certainly a lot of space and scope for partnership that should be encouraged.
We have been hearing about a few projects that have stopped working so well after scaling up. Would the solution be to invest in small, independent, and local projects?
The agenda on scale up is still quite young. It's in its early days, and it's in the making. And as Sally was saying, we're all learning from each other. There's a number of we're looking at very different aspects. There's a lot of different studies ongoing now, trying different models at different scales, but those are generating results, and there's different strategies. You know, if you do home visits versus groups, we're doing that in India. Different sizes of groups in Bangladesh, and it's been successful. Integrating with health clinics. There was a study in Jamaica that has also shown impacts by having delivering all of the messages from ReachUp, a subset of messages from ReachUp in the health clinics, while moms are waiting for their regular visits with their nurse. And so I think we need to continue to be creative and think very critically but very strategically about the issues of implementation and keep working. I do not think it's time to give up yet, because we've been doing this for too little. And there is more and more evidence that is being generated. But we need to work towards developing more. That doesn't mean that there's no space for local initiatives to help come up with ideas and innovations that then we can try at scale. And actually, that's part of, at the IDV recently, since last year, there's so the Inter-American Development Bank, the Early Childhood Development Fund has been created, and this is for private foundations and private donors to support efforts to invest in innovations that can be scalable. So I think we're still hoping that, we're still working towards trying to get there.
Hi. When I do stories about the cost efficiency of prevention, whether it be ECD or healthcare or a variety of things, it always comes down to politics, and the politicians who are allocating the funds today are not going to be in power when the fruits come. Have you ever come across a politician that was willing to say, I'm willing to take money out of my budget today, even though it will be the politicians in 20 years that reap the benefit from it?
Well, and yes, I mean that's the Kunamas bed was that. I mean, that was set as a national program, and there was all of that investment and the initial evaluation results. They invested in this without knowing what the results would be, and they made the effort. Now, the other critical question, I mean, that is a challenge, and the politicians do want to see immediate results, and so for that, there is that temptation to invest in interventions that have more visibility, right? And if we're thinking of daycares, well, what has visibility is the daycare. What doesn't have as much visibility is the quality of the service that is being provided. So there is that temptation of building the nice, fancy daycare and not. But there's investments and commitments being made. Another struggle is to then ensure that the programs are sustained, right? And the way you had initially conceptualized it. So the way one administration had initially conceptualized it, and for the new administration to not come in and wanting to do something else or different, and just because they want to detach from a previous administration, you know, and ensure sufficient continuity in the agendas. But for instance, in Colombia, that was resolved by there's a law now, and investment in early childhood has been passed as a national law. So what that's done is ring fence some of the resources and the importance of the topic. So yes, more and more. I mean, not sufficient, but more and more.
Sorry. Hi.
Hi.
I wanted to ask you. You are a researcher, so you do these long studies. Seeing and following people for a long time. So I wanted to know, how long do you think it will take to have enough data to say, okay, this has been running for I don't know how long time, and it is working? It is a tough question because, for example, in Chile, we have this program that is Chile Crece Contigo, which has been running now for 10 years, and actually has been extended. It was until 6 years old, and now I think it is 12, which is, we think, great. But however, 10 years, and you can see that local researchers haven't enough data to say, I mean, there is a feeling that it's working, and because even internationally it has been mentioned and have received like prizes and stuff, but we don't know yet. And you say, okay, how long we should take so we can see in money and health and whatever?
Well, so what the earlier studies that have long-term follow-ups have shown is that you do a lot of the outcomes that attract attention and help contribute, make the case, that are 20, 30, 40 years down the line. So that doesn't mean that as you go along, you cannot evaluate and understand what's going on and then make improvements to your own intervention and sort of continue to contribute to making that policy as effective as possible. But I mean, I think it depends on the argument you want to make. The outcomes that you want to show. Yeah, they want to.
For media, it's also important to show as soon as possible that it is working at least in some amount.
But you can show you can show impacts on immediate outcomes, so immediate child development after, I don't know, usually many studies are run for a year and a half or 2 years. So you could look at that. That's what most evaluations do. But you would continue to generate evidence going past that.
Oh, sorry. I had already called on Beth. Can we do Beth and then you and then wrap up there?
I just wanted to ask you something. I've always been so concerned about the length of programs. So what I mean by this is, in South Africa, there's positive parenting programs and there's book sharing and there's a few interventions. But I often find, is it long enough? Because, yes, you can come in for a 6-week intervention. Does that, I mean, how do you I know that it costs money, so it also has to be, effective. But surely, I just find that, especially mental health interventions and psychological interventions, they really should be sometimes years even, because there's so much trauma.
Right. So, well, this is where you continue to think of the life cycle approach. It's not that you stop in early childhood and you intervene then. There needs to be a continuation of services and articulation across strategies. So you invest in the early years with particular programs, but then you need to provide for good quality preschool services and then schooling education. Is that answering?
I think it's more about, I'm talking specifically about ECD services. So let's say a positive parenting program, that's a 6-week intervention. Surely that should be a 2-year intervention.
Long.
Is long. So some of the programs that she was talking about are, so Cuna Más, or Crianza Feliz is 3 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was 3 years. But also, and that's something I forgot to say, but it's very important for economists, whether after, with all of these interventions, you want to change behavior, And then one would presume that eventually one could get out, stop intervening if you've gotten to the behavioral change that you wanted to achieve. Whether that is real or is science fiction, I don't know. You know, like think of all of us trying to change our own behavior, getting to the gym. But you know, when we promise that no, I'm serious. But there is that intentionality with all of these programs, a lot of the parenting programs in particular, maybe not so much about daycare. I mean, that's a service that one needs to provide. But in the parenting programs and improving the quality of interactions in the home environment, there's this presumption that eventually you're going to change behavior so you could.
Yeah. I don't know how many of you have kids, but I know not to yell at my kids, and I still yell at them all the time. So you had one question?
So if there's no report on the country's ECD, how can we as journalists do a story on it? You know, what characteristics should we look for?
At what level? On the country strategy?
Yeah. Or the quality of services provided.
In terms of resources, there's more and more reports from the OECDs and the IDBs and the it depends on the regional area, but there's a number of research institutes that are producing more and sort of comprehensive reports on specific themes. That would be a place to start.
If there's no report and say that it's a regional program, what would you look for? Like if you visited
and there's
it?
no research. Oh, if you're visiting.
Example,
Oh, talk to the local providers. Talk to the people on the ground and ask them as many questions as you can on what is their day to day, what are they doing, what are the challenges that they're facing, what do they think they are achieving, and then go up but start down there and then go up, I think.
And the quality of the interactions between the
Yeah.
caregivers and I mean, it's honestly, a lot of it is just the same
How can you
reporting
see
skills you have,
yeah,
but you'll,
quality.
I promise you'll know it. I mean, if
Yeah.
there's kids crying and they're ignored and they're not being
Yeah.
touched and they're bored and they are
Yeah, you'll
frustrated and they're hitting each other, or if you go in and no, seriously.
No,
I mean,
look out for that because if
it's like it's the quality. So it's called serve and return. It's literally the quality of the interaction between the caregiver and the adult. I just want to wrap up with one quick point that gets to your Joan said something interesting this morning. She said we've moved from data compliance to data to improvement. So I think just to your point of when I was interviewing Marta about the Columbia follow-up study, which showed that all the effects had faded out, which is obviously not the result they were hoping for. I said, this looks like pretty bad news. And she said, this is data for improvement. This is like what we need to fix. So let's not look at it. And this is, I think, journalists, myself included, very guilty of doing this. It's a success story or it's a failure, right? It's a continuum, right? These are human beings. This is not this is not an algorithm that we're trying to correct and fix. This is a process that's super messy and involves a lot of people. So it's just a way to think about it as we're reporting on. Like, it doesn't mean like the whole thing's over. It means that didn't work. That's a really important data point, and this is going to help inform how we're going to fix it. And thank you very much.
That's a great place. Jenny and Marta, thank you. I would also say that bleeds over into the conversations we're going to be having tomorrow about craft challenges and what are some innovations we need to make as reporters. It may be that there is some stuff we can do with database reporting, aggregating and analyzing data that's no one else has bothered to put together, for example. This is a conversation for tomorrow. So we're going to break for lunch until 12:30. When we come back, we have a kind of a cool thing. Earlier, you heard Joan talking about early childhood informed urban design. We're going to have a conversation on that and then go on a little field trip. I have no idea even where it's going to be. This is a big surprise.